a Soviet envelope from the 1960s. The address on it names Chelyabinsk, an industrial city of roughly 800,000 people in the southern Urals, and then it gives a number. The number is 40. There was no District 40 in Chelyabinsk. The letter was not going to Chelyabinsk. It was going about 100 kilometers northwest, to a town built between 4 lakes, which had no name. The number was a post office box. Dozens of Soviet towns were addressed this way. Arzamas 16, Sverdlovsk 44, Krasnoyarsk 26, the nearest real city, and a box. The convention held so completely that the towns took the box numbers as their names. Chelyabinsk-40 later became Chelyabinsk-65 when the postal code changed. The town itself moved nowhere. The documents of the people who lived there said the same thing. Birth certificates and internal passports recorded them as born in Chelyabinsk. Many of them had never been to Chelyabinsk. The demographer Murray Feshbach set out what secret had meant once it could be described. The cities were on no Soviet map. They were not counted in the population and not counted in the labor force. Nothing exploded here. Nobody covered up a mistake. The state recorded, as ordinary administrative practice for 40 years, that 80,000 people were somewhere else. Construction began in November 1945 on the shore of Lake Urals. The site was chosen for water and for distance, deep in the Urals, out of bomber range, with 4 lakes to cool a reactor. The work was done by prisoners. How many is not settled? Some accounts put it above 40,000. Others give 70,000, drawn from 12 camps. The record does not resolve the difference. This was not an aberration. At the time, Gulag labor made up roughly 23% of the non-agricultural workforce of the Soviet Union. The closed cities were built with the labor that was available. Kate Brown records the order that began it. An NKVD general directed that the city be built at Junction T, described in the instruction as a remote crossing of 2 footpaths in the woods. The prisoners built a construction site, then a road, then somewhere to live. When it was habitable, they were moved out of it. The people who lived in the city were not the people who made it. Plutonium production began in December 1948. The plant was called Combine 817, and later Mayak, the Russian word for lighthouse. It ran reactors and a chemical plant to pull the plutonium back out of them. The town attached to it had no name at all. In its own paperwork, it was a base number, then a post box. It was given a name, Ozyorsk, in 1994, 47 years after its founding date. The historian Asif Siddiqui has argued that the closed city borrowed directly from the Gulag camp. The same physical isolation, the same language of obfuscation, applied now to people who were not prisoners. Siddiqui calls the result atomized urbanism. His phrase for it is the tension between the obdurate reality of the city and the goal of the state to obliterate that reality through secrecy. A Soviet census counted people by place. The people in this place were not entered. Feshbach's summary is the plainest available. Not on the map, not in the population, not in the workforce. How many such cities existed was itself unclear. Writing in 1993, Feshbach reported 3 separate figures circulating in the former Soviet Union: 10 or 16, or as many as 87. A child born in the city in 1955 was born into that arithmetic. The hospital was real. The birth was attended and registered. The place of birth entered on the certificate was a city 100 kilometers away. The distinction matters. The child was not hidden. The child was recorded, accurately, in every particular except the one that said where the life had begun. Children there went to ordinary Soviet schools. Ozyorsk had 16 secondary schools, 2 of them specializing in English, a gymnasium, and a physics and mathematics lyceum. By the standards of a Soviet provincial town, this was an unusually good education, and it was not accidental. The city's purpose required physicists, so the schools were built to produce them. What the schools did not teach was the one thing every adult in the city knew. That lesson arrived somewhere else, and it usually arrived the first time a child left. Nadezhda Kutepova was born in the city. She has described understanding that something was different on a school trip outside it, when the children were told not to say where they were from. Her account of the moment is plain. She said she began to think there was something special about their place, but that she did not know what exactly. That is the shape the secrecy took here. Not an explanation, not a threat, an instruction about what could not be said, given to children old enough to travel and not old enough to be told why. Adults were held to it formally, in writing. Residents leaving the city were forbidden to reveal where they lived, and the prohibition carried criminal liability. Accounts of the period describe a cover story issued for use beyond the checkpoint, where a person was from, what they did, why they could not be visited. That practice is widely reported and thinly documented. The written record of it is what survives best. Undertakings signed, clearances granted, permissions logged. Secrecy in a closed city was not an atmosphere. It was a filing system. And there is another half to that childhood which is usually left out of the story because it is harder to use and because it does not sound like an accusation. The city was safe in a way that almost nowhere else in the Soviet Union was safe. A former resident, named in the account only as Konstantin, described the effect it had on him. As a child, he said, the word city meant something protected. People from outside, he lists former prisoners, swindlers, beggars, simply could not get in. He was 6 years old the first time he traveled beyond the fence. He said the first thing he saw was an old woman begging in the street, and that it was a genuine shock. That is not a description of a prison. It is a description of the moment a child found out what the rest of his country looked like. The plant made plutonium. Reactors on the site irradiated uranium. A radiochemical plant then dissolved the fuel and separated the plutonium out of it. Workers were exposed to external gamma radiation, and in the separation plants to plutonium aerosols they breathed. Permitted doses in the first decade were far above anything allowed afterwards. The compensation was material, and it was real. One published account of conditions in the closed cities puts the salary supplement at 20% above the equivalent job elsewhere. That figure rests on a single source and should be held loosely. The larger advantage was never really in rubles. It was in what rubles could actually buy. Shops in the closed cities were stocked when shops elsewhere were not. Sausage, in a country where sausage was a scarce good, could simply be bought. So could fruit out of season, decent clothing, perfume, and imported goods that most Soviet citizens of the period encountered mainly in films. The queue, which organized ordinary Soviet life, was largely absent here. Brown puts the gap in durable terms. At one point, residents of the city owned between 2 and 20 times as many cars and household appliances as the Soviet average. There were 5-day working weeks, paid holidays, and rest homes reserved for nuclear workers. After Stalin's death, the state sent architects to design new apartments, shops, and cinemas. The physicist Lev Altshuler, describing the parallel life at Arzamas 16, called the atomic sites a white archipelago. He said leading researchers were paid a very large salary for those times. Altshuler's summary was that their families experienced no needs, that the supply of food and goods was quite different, and that all material questions were removed. An engineer at Chelyabinsk-40, Nikolai Robotnov, wrote that inside the barbed labyrinth, he was sure he inhaled the air of freedom. That is one man's sentence in one memoir, and it carries no more weight than that. People competed to get in. Residents required clearance by the security service, and being cleared was itself a form of standing. One resident described it as pride that the state trusted them enough to live there. The cost of the arrangement was paid, In the first years, mostly by people who did not live inside the fence and were never asked whether they wanted to pay it. Between 1949 and 1956, the plant discharged liquid radioactive waste directly into the Teka River. The total release has been estimated at around 100 petabecquerels. The river ran through farming country. Roughly 30,000 people in the villages along it were chronically exposed, largely Tatar and Bashkir farming families, who were told nothing about what the water carried. Fences went up along the floodplain in 1956. About 10,000 people in 19 riverside villages were moved, some of them 100 kilometers downstream of the plant. One of the most contaminated villages, Muslyumovo, was not moved. Its residents were resettled between 2006 and 2012, 50 years after the fences went up. Inside the perimeter, there was better food, better housing, and continuous medical monitoring by an institute set up to do nothing else. Outside it, along the river, there was the river. In September 1957, a waste tank at the plant exploded and threw contamination across thousands of square kilometers. The Soviet government did not acknowledge it until 1989. That accident has been documented at length elsewhere, and it is not the subject here. It matters in this episode only because of how little it changed. The city was not evacuated. People went to work the next day, and many were sent out to clear up. Digging out shrubs, coating equipment with lead, clearing debris at the plant. Everything about entering the city was governed by paper. A resident of Sarov, another closed city, described 3 kinds of pass in use: one-time, temporary, and permanent. A permanent pass required either being born in the city or working at its main enterprise. There was no third route to obtaining one. The other 2 were issued only after review by the security service and only to close relatives of residents or to people traveling on approved business. This is what the secrecy did to a family. A grandmother in another town could visit only if the service guarding the city decided she could, and only after it had looked into her. Marriages were made inside the fence, and so were friendships, careers, and enmities. The population reached around 80,000, large enough to be a real city, small enough that everyone's work was the same work. Everybody in the city knew what the plant made. Nobody outside it was permitted to know that they knew. The secret was not kept from the people keeping it, only from everyone else. The children of those marriages were born with an automatic permanent pass and a birth certificate naming a city they had not been born in. The second generation inherited both documents. There is a line a former resident used, long afterwards, about what people take with them when they leave the house. In other cities, he said, people name a phone or a watch. In Ozyorsk, he said, everybody will proudly answer, a pass and a passport. He was not complaining about it. He offered it as a boast. Radiation sickness was a recognized condition in the Soviet Union, with a name, a literature, and a treatment protocol. At Mayak, for reasons of secrecy, it was not the diagnosis that got written down. Workers presenting with it were recorded instead as having astheno-vegetative syndrome, a vague, non-specific label covering fatigue and weakness, which committed the record to nothing. The illness was treated. The treatment was real, and in some respects the medical attention was better than anything available elsewhere in the country. What was withheld was the word. The word had consequences. A worker with an unnamed illness could not claim compensation for a named one, and neither, afterwards, could the family. Nadezhda Kutupova's grandmother worked on the cleanup after the 1957 accident. Kutupova has said her mother's compensation was later canceled, that she fought the decision until she became ill, and that she died in a clinic. That is one family's account, given by one surviving member of it. No independent record of the case is available in English, and it should be held as testimony rather than as documentation. Kutupova ran an organization in the city that helped residents pursue compensation claims. In 2015, she was accused in the Russian press of industrial espionage. She left the country and was granted asylum in France. The organization was formally liquidated in 2018 on the stated grounds that it had no activity. By then, there was nobody left in the city to conduct any. And then there is the part of this that does not resolve, which is what the record shows when the record is finally opened and counted properly. It is not the finding the story leads to. In 1988, an institute in the city established a cause of death register. It received a paper copy of the original death certificate of every resident who had died there, going back to 1948. The state that had not counted these people in its census had in fact counted them exactly. It had simply never counted them in public. That register was analyzed and published in 2015. It covers deaths from 1953 to 2010. It does not say what the shape of this story leads people to expect. All-cause mortality among the plant's workers was lower than the Russian national rate. For men, the ratio was 0.65. For women, 0.56. Measured not against the country, but against the other residents of their own city, it was still lower. 0.77 for men and 0.74 for women. The authors are careful about what this can and cannot show. It is a population-level analysis. It cannot isolate radiation risk, and the workforce was a screened and medically monitored group from the start. Studies of the same workforce at individual level find nothing reassuring at all. They follow a cohort of 17,740 workers hired between 1948 and 1972, and they track what those workers died of. By the end of 2003, there had been 681 deaths from lung cancer in that cohort, 75 from liver cancer, and 30 from cancer of the bone. 786 in total. 239 of those deaths, about 30% of them, are attributed by the researchers directly to plutonium exposure at the plant. Both findings come from the same population, and both are sound. The plant gave its workers a particular set of cancers. The city gave them, on average, more years than the country outside would have. There is no arrangement of those two findings that comes out comfortable, and the honest position is that both of them are true at once, and that the second does not cancel the first. In 1989, as the Soviet system began admitting what it had built, the residents of the city were polled on whether it should be opened. They voted to keep it closed. The question was put again in 1999 after the state that built the city had ceased to exist. The answer was the same. Brown records that half the nuclear scientists said they would refuse to stay if it opened. Both polls were run by the authority whose budget depended on the answer, and neither methodology is available for inspection in English. The result is on the record. The process is not. The reasons residents gave were not ideological. Federal subsidy, low crime, good medicine, good schools, and a stated fear of what removing the barrier would let in. Ozyorsk was granted its name in 1994, and it remains closed. So do about 44 acknowledged cities in Russia, holding roughly 1.5 million people, with perhaps 15 more whose names have never been published. Its population was 82,000 at the 2010 census and about 76,000 by 2023. People are free to leave now. Most of them have not. The children born there in the 1950s are in their 70s. Their birth certificates still named Chelyabinsk. Correcting them has never been anybody's priority. Ozyorsk appears on maps now, and it is still closed. The register at the Institute is still open, and it still runs back to 1948, to the first name that was entered in it.